As the saying goes, there's more to us than meets the eye. And in fact, many of the dimensions of diversity that are more closely and deeply connected to our identity are those you can't see. So today, that's what we're going to explore. What are those dimensions? Now, our goals today are to understand what I mean when I say invisible diversity, walk through some of the more common dimensions, and all the while, it'll try to help us understand how those invisible dimensions are tied to our identity. I'm Jana Etienne, CEO of Etienne Consulting. I'm a coach and a facilitator centered on workplace cultures that foster connection and nurture belonging. I help what I call curious challengers practice what I call fearless inclusion, and that's the freedom to be yourself and the art of creating space for others to do the same. It's the combination of intention and consistent action that shatter those unseen barriers, some of which we're going to explore today. I've been a DEI practitioner for nearly 10 years, and I support organizations with identifying and then implementing DEI initiatives, weaving that into their training and leadership development programs, as well as coaching executives and senior leaders so that they can lead high-performing teams and diverse organizations in meaningful ways. I wanted to start with snowflakes. In an effort, or in our effort to raise awareness of and appreciation for diversity in the workplace, too often we group people in categories: people of color, people by gender, LGBTQ identity, disabilities or different abilities. So walking through the program today, think about how complex we are. You know, no two snowflakes are alike. And the same goes with humans. We are a complicated bunch. And we're going to explore a little bit more about what about all of us is different from inside. So first polling question: how familiar are you with this concept of invisible diversity? Very familiar, somewhat familiar, a little familiar, or not familiar? As organizations, oh, sorry, go ahead, Meryl.
No, I was just going to let everyone know that I've launched the poll. We'll leave it open for about 60 seconds. I'll leave it to you to continue.
All right. If you need to close it, show the results, and then I'll know we're at the 60 seconds. While it's open, I will just sort of share that, you know, organizations, as we think more holistically about DEI, any difference that makes a difference, that's something we want to notice and understand. So, you know, invisible diversity, looking beyond the obvious, or have I given the answer away? So let me see I have not opened the polling questions panel.
We are just a few more seconds from closing this one down. I'm going to close the poll in 3, 2, and 1. You able to see the results on screen?
I see 8% very familiar, 22% somewhat familiar. I'll go with the 45% not familiar. So that's almost half. So I'm glad you're with me today. And in fact, I'm going to encourage everyone, put your questions or your comments in the Q&A. I'm going to try to keep my eye on it, but Beryl has promised to ping me if it seems like I haven't been tracking it well enough. So what is hidden diversity? I define it as those differences that aren't immediately recognizable when you see someone for the first time. In fact, stepping back from the moment, there are dimensions of identity that we may never know about someone unless we meet them in some way. So for example, think about this. They could be the barista at Starbucks, the cashier at the grocery store, the person you always see when you go to the gym. We only know things about them based on what we observe. And only then it's based on the interaction we have. So the barista might have an accent. The cashier in the grocery store, you have a little chatter and you realize they're a new parent, or the person you've always seen at the gym, come to find out they have a hearing loss. And so hidden diversity refers to all of those dimensions that I call, you see here on the slide, hiding in plain sight. I was checking the slide to make sure that's what I wrote, hiding in plain sight. And so what we may not notice or see in a brief interaction, it will hopefully or more likely become clearer over time And so all of those dimensions are things that could be inherent, meaning I was born with it, or acquired, I developed it over my lifetime. Concealed, meaning I actually put an effort in to hide it. Withheld, I actively work to keep it from becoming known. Some of these dimensions carry stigma. They're negative stereotypes, and that's why people might choose to hide them, because it's just easier to pass as somebody without the fill in the blank. And familiarity can be misleading. Don't assume because you share a dimension that you know that person, and that we tend to fall into that trap as well. So this is where empathy is really good. It's about understanding what someone else is experiencing, because sympathy, you're just feeling bad for the other person, and no one wants sympathy. It can sometimes feel judgmental or marginalizing. And so that's why recognizing all of these dimensions of diversity are particularly important. Now, depending on where you look, Google will tell you, all these different places will tell you that as much as 90% of an iceberg is hidden below the surface. And of course, it's going to vary depending on the iceberg. Its true size and shape can only be determined by understanding the scale of what's underwater. And this is the same with people. Okay, so people are snowflakes and people are icebergs, but hang in there with me, because you really do need to dig a little bit deeper, no pun intended, go deeper under the water to understand all of the things we're seeing in a person. And in my example here, I just came up with as many as I could think of that would fit on the slide and be a good visual. There's so many more. So above the waterline, as you can see here, above the waterline, what you can see visible. I'm right there on the water, I can look. Below the waterline, it's going to be harder and harder to see as we go deeper down into the water. So first, thinking of the waterline as the point where you first meet someone, walking up to them on the street, they walk into the office, you've not said a word, you just see them. So these are the easiest things to notice. They're right there at sea level, if you will. Race, age, gender, do they have a visible disability? And then, you know, the hi, nice to meet you, and you just start to have some conversation. You've just been introduced and started to interact. There's some other things you might notice. They won't necessarily be things that jump out at you right away, but they are visible, and so you can start to pick up on them. Ethnicity, actions, behaviors, things like that. Now, the same is true with those dimensions that are just under the waterline. Yes, they're a little bit harder to see, but they're visible. You look down out of the boat, you see under the water, you can see what's right there. So these are the things you're going to learn about somebody as you get to know them more. They don't require a particularly close or intimate relationship, but you might not necessarily know about these things without an interaction. Now let's go another level down. As we go deeper, there are other dimensions that we can only come to know and learn when we get to know someone. So in my experience, I've often realized that I've made an assumption about someone's background, only to discover later, as some of those lower dimensions are revealed, it's not quite what I thought. So I may have been close, but I may have still missed the mark. For example, I assumed they were an introvert because they were quiet in meetings, only to realize it was more about organizational politics and power dynamics. You know, a great example is my husband. His first language is French, but you couldn't tell that certainly by looking at him, and not necessarily by listening to him speak, because he has no detectable accent. So if that were the case, and then I happen to hear him speaking in French to somebody, say it's his sister on the phone, I might be a bit surprised, taken aback. Not that it's a bad thing. This is really about, ultimately, the assumptions that we make about people. Then you go all the way down. This is where it's really deep down in the water level. There are dimensions here we may never know about someone unless they shared it with us, or because our relationship got close enough, we've grown closer and they reveal these things to us. Or what about if you're in the HR department, somebody has an invisible disability and comes to you seeking an accommodation, and we'll talk about that in a moment. That's when you might find out about this aspect of the person. And so these are just some examples, as I mentioned, that I picked for this illustration. Oops, sorry about that. Didn't mean to go forward. So in my sessions and workshops, when I ask people to reflect on looking at this illustration, and just think about which are those dimensions that really resonate for you, that are a reflection of your identity, your self-view. And almost all of the time, a few exceptions, of course, everybody picks the things that are below the waterline. So if they pick the things above the waterline, sometimes it's because it's even more nuanced than that. And my example is I used to do this, but I actually don't anymore. When I went through this exercise, I would pick race. And I picked race because I'm biracial. And that actually was something that it's tied very closely to my self-view. Now, as I've thought about this in more nuanced in ways, I tend not to pick race, although it's still a meaningful part of my identity. Right, so now the next slide. What I'm visualizing for you here, or hoping to, is that when we notice somebody for the first time, those things that are right there at sea level, or that we see these race or culture, background, or what we perceive to be somebody's race, ethnicity, or culture. We also notice their gender, and that's often based on how they're expressing that gender. And then with the age we think they are, although I have learned when I ask my neighbor if his daughters are those your grandchildren? Yeah, let's not make assumptions about someone's age. But just because I don't verbalize it doesn't mean we haven't noticed it. And so how often are we wrong on these things? Well, I just gave you that really horrible example. I struggled to talk to that neighbor after that. Now the data, which is interesting, when you look at some of the research that's been done here, we don't necessarily always notice these in the same order, but we notice all of these almost instantaneously. So for example, for some, and it might be cultural, it just might be the way that our brains are wired, we'll talk about that too, we might notice gender and then race. And then we start to pick up on the age. And the order that you notice things may have some influence on the way you perceive somebody. It doesn't matter, these little micro moments. What matters is these are the first things that jump out at us. And when we see them, a series of interesting things happen. So we see race, culture, age. We see what we think is disability, visually anyway, gender. And the reason I want to illustrate it this way is this is another way of looking at that iceberg. So there's that outer layer here, what we see. Now, the reason I said race, what we're actually noticing is skin tone. And there is a wide range of skin tone in all races. And so we're noticing that. And in fact, often that's behind a comment that I've heard, I don't see color. Well, you do. We do see color. And I think when we talk about that, what we're referring to is we're not projecting something onto somebody because of their race. At least we're not intending to. And so I just wanted to bring that up because we tend to make assumptions and we want to be careful because why? Well, we notice these things, but we make our perceptions immediately are things like, based on what we noticed, is this person safe? Is this person the boss? Do I have something in common with this person? They're like me. Oh, wow, I think they're going to be a really smart person. There are all kinds of things that we start to project onto that person. And this is just from that surface level. But then we go a little bit deeper. We start to go under the waterline and we learn something about you. We don't just assume, we're not looking at our initial reactions and perceptions. And as a result, we learn more about you and we get to know you. And this is great. Let's see. So then we go down to the next level. More things are revealed to us. And shockingly, often we are relearning some of those things that we thought we knew. Some of the things that we know will be validated and we'll come to understand them more. And then you get deep down below the waterline and you get to most of these things here are invisible dimensions of diversity. And what are we doing? We're relearning them again. And so what's important here is that as we start to categorize people, when we start to think about diversity, we should be looking at diversity more broadly. Yes, we often think about race and gender and LGBTQ identity, and all of this is important. And in fact, let me go back to this iceberg here for a second. Think about all of the other dimensions that we could put here. And I mean, if you think of any, drop them in the Q&A as a comment. The visible dimensions. Okay, hairstyle, for example, maybe somebody's wearing makeup, maybe they're not. I know this has been this big discussion for women in the last couple of years about, do you have to wear heels in the office? So there are things that are visible. What about facial hair? These are things that you'll notice. But when you start to think about all the other elements of somebody's background, their experience, were they adopted as a child? Have they adopted children? What if they are the child of a same-sex couple? I don't know why I can't talk this morning. You could start to fill in a whole bunch of things here below the waterline. And all of those dimensions, they come together in unique combinations, and that's what makes it snowflakes. You know, we're snowflakes. Remember, thinking about snowflakes. All right, so let me get back to here. Now, so I created this, oh, somebody says in here, thank you, a non-traditional work role as a dimension. Absolutely. All of those things that we don't think about. Please put some more in there because I love having these different examples. Now, what I did here was try to start pulling in a whole bunch of the different dimensions that in theory we could talk about. So I have here citizenship. Are they a survivor? What about their conviction history? Socioeconomic background, immigrant status, upbringing. I mean, look at that list. Age, heritage. These are all things about people that you generally don't see. Now, do we have time to talk about all of those today? No. So what I'm going to do is I'm focusing on these three because these are the most common ones. So disability. More disabilities are invisible than visible. Neurodiversity, that one we've been hearing a lot more about. We're going to spend some time there. And then mental health and wellness. And we've talked about the importance of this in the workplace. But do we really understand it? Now, this is a 1-hour session. I do want to allow time for Q&A. Please be sure to drop your questions in there as we go so that I know that there are questions that would be helpful. So, but there's so much more. You could do an entire session on neurodiversity, or we could do a lot around disability, because until and unless we can understand some of the nuances, some of the complexities, some of the challenges, and some of the barriers, it's going to be difficult to really think about how to create inclusive programs, reevaluate benefits and policies for people in these groups. So let's start with disability and understanding disability. Right here, the definition: a physical or mental condition that limits movement, senses, activities, or emotions. They can be visible or invisible. You know, sometimes people look at disabilities and just focus on the impairment part. They might think that someone with a disability is less worthy or less capable, that they might need help. I was in the grocery store last summer, I remember this, and a woman comes in, she's in a wheelchair, and two things came to mind. One, she was in one of those wheelchairs that I remember seeing in the Paralympics, which made me think maybe she's a competitive athlete. And then the other thing that almost always pops up into my mind, well, as I've learned and reflected on this more, this doesn't happen, but it used to happen, which is to, in some ways, feel bad about the person, because in my mind, as she's coming in, it's going to be more difficult for her to just shop. She goes to a window, a door in the refrigerated section. She opens the door and I can see she's reaching up for something. And it took everything I had to go over there and say, can I get that for you? Because here's the reality. If she needed help, she would ask for it, just like you and I. If we need help, we'll ask for it. And so we tend to project onto somebody with a visible disability that there's a problem in their body that needs to be fixed, and they're going to need my help to do that. And that only people that don't have those disabilities are normal. And so that can be a very harmful way of thinking. Another perspective that's not helpful about seeing somebody with a disability is seeing it as tragic or pitiable, because this viewpoint makes it seem like disabilities are something that result in a lesser quality of life. And then finally, there's those social interactions. When people hold on to misconceptions about disability, it'll negatively impact the way they interact with those individuals. I was watching a TED Talk the other day, and a woman, she was in a wheelchair, she was coming out of the mall, and a woman came up to her and said that she was so inspired by her. And she said, wait, you're inspired by me because I'm in a wheelchair? I'm just trying to go to the mall. And so that's the kind of thing that we want to be thoughtful of. It's really important to challenge those harmful ideas and those misconceptions. That's how we're going to create a more inclusive and understanding work environment. So I just thought I'd share some statistics. These are from the CDC, and this might be surprising for some, but 61 million adults in the United States live with a disability, and it's roughly 1 in 4. So the highest percentage of people living with disabilities is in the South. Like, who knew? Just an interesting fact. The percentage of the adults with different types of functional disabilities vary. So 13% mobility challenges, almost 11% cognitive disability, difficulties concentrating, remembering, making decisions. And some of those are medical challenges, and some of those might be dimensions of neurodiversity or type of a neurodiversity. We're going to look at those here in a moment. Almost 7% have a challenge living independently. Almost 6% are deaf or significant hearing disability or challenges, and so on. Vision, okay, I can't talk today. Vision disabilities or blindness, and so forth. So mobility is a challenge. Think about if you're going to do an interview and you're inviting people to your office for those interviews. How accessible is it? Does somebody with a wheelchair need to go out of their way to get in the door? And then what will their experience be like going from the front door to the room where you're having the interview? For example, are there escalators? And so going to the elevator means going out of the way. I mean, what does that experience feel like? And so these are the types of things we want to be thinking about. 2 in 5 adults age 65 or older have a disability. Now, what's interesting here is that 1 in 4 have a disability. Many of us, that number will grow as we get older. Remember, I mentioned an acquired dimension of diversity later. That's what's going to happen. And 70% of those disabilities, by the way, I don't think I mentioned this before, are invisible. So think about this. In a room of 100 people, a random room, 25 of them are likely to have a disability. 70% of those you won't be able to see. So it's just interesting. This is from the, where did I get this? The World Health Organization, I believe. And that globally, over 1 billion people live with a form of disability. So I share these statistics because this isn't, this is more common than we realize. And we might not have noticed it so much in the workplace because of challenges for employment with people with disabilities. Now, I wanted to share this little picture. I made this up the other day. I thought it was kind of cute. Intersectionality. And that's how all of these things come together, you know, all of those invisible dimensions that form our identity, that make up who we are. Well, what's important about intersectionality is when you start looking at the combination, the whole snowflake idea, when we start talking about accommodations or challenges with disabilities or the neurodiversity, the types of neurodiversity, you can't disassociate or disconnect someone from any one of these dimensions. And so we want to make sure we're thinking holistically about the people that we're trying to support and serve, particularly in our DEI efforts. Now, I was saying the thing about the the most recent thing I said about disability in the workforce is the reason when you look at the employment statistics aren't that great. And so while it might be more widespread in society, we tend not to see it so much in the workplace, either because it's invisible and people are holding back on that, not revealing it or not disclosing it. But it's also because there's just a higher unemployment rate for people with disabilities. Almost 20% of people with a disability were employed, only 20% versus 64% for people without a disability. That's a huge gap. And so that's something that we want to think about. Now, accommodations. This is also often misunderstood. You see here in the definition, a reasonable accommodation is basically asking for assistance in the workplace so that you don't have a barrier in order to get the job done. Now, in 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed and prohibits discrimination. It also requires employers to provide an accommodation that's reasonable, and essentially it's going to remove the barrier. Now, here's the thing. Accommodation, some people struggle with those because they see, well, this person's getting something and I'm not getting it. It's not fair. Well, sameness isn't necessarily fairness. And what's important about accommodation here is that it's providing equity. It's giving someone the tools and the resources that they need to thrive, to have a sane chance at getting the work done. So imagine somebody who's hard of hearing. A reasonable accommodation might be providing a sign language interpreter. And in fact, turning on subtitles. I often do that in my sessions. Let me give you an example of what that looks like. So if we have someone in our organization that is suffering with hearing loss, doesn't mean they're deaf, but something like this, the subtitles can be very helpful for them. This is simple, it costs us nothing, and yet it can help level the playing field. What's also interesting about this, and I don't know if this is how it is for you, but I have found subtitles while watching television is very important. All shows, not just shows that are in foreign languages, because one of the things we learn is a solution, often for a marginalized group, supports everyone. If you've ever heard that saying, I'm not sure I'm going to get it right, but rising tides lift all boats. That's the idea here. The other thing might be somebody who has ADHD and they find it difficult to focus. Maybe you give them a quiet space and noise canceling headphones. It costs almost nothing, but the results and the benefits can really be huge and go a long way to creating that sense of inclusion and providing that level of support to really help that employee thrive. I think I'm going to leave the subtitling on. And I hope that it's helpful, and I regret not turning it on sooner. All right, let's switch to neurodiversity. So you see here in the definition, neurodivergence is when a brain process of a person is different from that of others, either due to genetic or environmental factors. Now, this term was coined in 1998 by Judy Singer. She was a sociologist who herself was on the autism spectrum. And she rejected the idea that autism was equal to disabled. Now that term neurodiverse eventually was expanded, and now it means a whole host of things. It has to do with differences of brain processing. You know, neurological variations are completely normal and they're vital to humanity. I mean, just like we have come in different sizes and shapes and colors, we're tall, we're short. Some of us are wider than others. I'm going to say that for myself at least. So all of these things, hairstyle, hair type, personality that we're hardwired in, all of these differences, we don't bat an eye. There's also differences in the very ways that we think and process information. And no, you haven't missed the second polling question because I've clustered the second and the third polling question together. So don't worry, we have 4 polling questions. I know we have to do those for CPE. Now, understanding neurodivergence. Well, first of all, neurodivergent, that term, it's not a medical term. It's really around how our brains process things. And rather than calling people normal or abnormal, which is really not positive and helpful language. It's actually marginalizing language. We use the term neurodivergent. Now, what does it mean to be neurodivergent? It just means we process things differently. Our brains function differently. We have different strengths. We also have different challenges. And some of these might actually include medical disorders or learning disabilities and other conditions. Now, I like this picture. I made this illustration up, and I liked it because, one, I'm visual. I learn best through visual and auditory stimulus. I don't do well learning from reading. That's how my brain is wired. And what I like about this illustration is it shows, you can see here that there's a flow, there's an interconnectedness in the range of the ways that neurodiversity can show up: reading, writing, senses, movement. I have ADHD, and I have firsthand experience with how I'm going to go ahead and call it a condition, but the way my brain is wired, how about I say it that, it falls along this entire spectrum. So for example, one might find it surprising that I can be sensitive to touch. And it doesn't happen all the time, but I go through periods at least once a day where things touching my skin are uncomfortable. And it's called tactile sensitivity or tactile defensiveness. And it's actually been reported by people with ADHD. It can be the result of sensory processing issues that are sometimes associated with ADHD. So feeling uncomfortable, irritated textures on the skin, clothing, physical contact. I've even had discomfort with air blowing along my skin. And as it turns out, I'm not making it up. And there's nothing wrong with me in terms of illness, which is what I used to think. So apart from them being these well-known symptoms of ADHD, there are a lot of other ones, and the same is true for a lot of the different dimensions. So here are the more common dimensions of or types of neurodiversity. You have the slides. You can read these definitions. So I don't want to spend a lot of time here. And that you should know that, and I'm going to show you here, I think I have the statistic coming up in a future slide. There are over 400 neurological differences in the brain that have been reported. I'm trying to think, do I have a note here on where you get that? Yes, it is the Neurological Institute, the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke. They have a list with over 400 neurological disorders. So clearly this just is doesn't cover it. The reason I picked these, though, are these are the ones that are most common. But I thought here some fun facts might be interesting. Share dyscalculia and dyslexia. Now you'll see on the next slide that actually the combination of these two things can result in an increased creativity. Daryl Hannah on the autism spectrum. Howie Mandel, ADHD. Tim Howard struggles with Tourette's. And what I find most inspiring about Tim Howard is, if you're not familiar, he used to be a goalie in the Everton in the English Premier League. He's now a sports commentator for NBC Sports Network. And when I found out that he had Tourette's, I was really amazed. Remember that whole, wow, I'm the woman who said she was inspired. But I say this with all due respect, because it's one thing to navigate your neurodiversity or any other type of challenge that you have. And it's another thing to do it entirely publicly on television. And so that takes an amount of bravery and an acknowledgement. So I just wanted to call that out. And then the two fun facts here, left-handedness and mixed-handedness, more common in neurodiverse people. And that the research suggests that with some neurodivergent professionals in some roles, they can be 30% more productive than those without them. So I really like this visual because it just shows that there is an interconnectedness with the different dimensions of neurodiversity, or the different types. So at the top, dyscalculia, and just to the right, dyslexia, share. And you see the interconnection there, creativity. And the reason these are important is, and often is the case, when you have one of these areas or challenges or types, you develop these coping mechanisms or strategies. Those ultimately result in different superpowers. And that's the way I like to think of it, as superpowers. So the challenge with neurodiversity is that workers may not always be able to thrive in their existing workplace because of norms and practices. And so on the job accommodations, I already gave an example, somebody with ADHD, give them some headphones, they can sit in a quieter space. Those are the types of things we're looking for. You know, maybe it's about reducing the lightness or screen brightness for somebody who has a visual impairment, providing access to supportive software like the closed captioning here, or allowing breaks for changes of activity and change in scenery. Just think about different ways that we can support people who are challenged with concentration, managing distractions, regulating emotions, recalling information, processing details quickly, or communicating effectively. All of these might manifest themselves differently based on different types of neurodiversity. Now, the other thing to think about here is that the diagnostic tools that we use to determine or assess these, they're largely based on Western norms. And so there's a high implication here then when we have cross-cultural assessments being done. So, for example, in some African and Asian countries, giving eye contact to an adult can be considered rude. Children won't be actively taught to do this, so maintaining eye contact there is not considered an autistic trait. But in other countries, it might be considered an autistic trait. So that's just something to think about. One, when we see somebody and make assumptions, but also when we think about the diagnosis themselves. All right, so for all of you who are asking, here's our second polling question. What percentage of the United States adult population struggles with mental illness? Less than 10%, maybe 15%, somewhere around 20%, 25%, or it says more than 15. Oops, I'm supposed to say more than 25%. Apparently we did not catch that edit, and my apologies for that. But I see most people are coming in at around 25%. The next largest group of responses say around 20%. So maybe I'm going to give this away, but perhaps you all have seen the handout because it's actually, wait for it, we're almost ready to close, so I can give it away. Closer to 23%, give or take. So it's right there in the middle of that. And so again, remember, 1 in 4 might have a disability. 23% might struggle with mental health. And mental health, you know, I was watching a show the other day and they called it brain health. And that's the way we really want to think about it, because almost 12% of people regularly feel worried or anxious. That's pretty eye-opening. It just goes to show that these conditions are more common than we think. 1 in 5 adults will experience a mental health struggle in their lifetime. 85% of workers in the United States say they're dealing with work-related stress. This just reinforces how important it is for employers to prioritize mental health and for us to be thoughtful and aware of this as we think about the environment that we are creating as colleagues or facilitating as managers. So I thought this was some interesting statistics here on the page. The data here, when you look at all of it, mental health at work is a real issue. And in fact, our millennials and Gen Z workers are starting to report higher instances of challenges in mental health. Now, there's some reasons some people will say it has to do with COVID and some of the things that have happened, and the impact that has had. But it's important to remember that it's not just them. And 91% of people think that workplace culture should support mental health. Thankfully, we're starting to see more organizations not only create new supports and resources, but boost awareness around them and start to destigmatize them. There are a lot of myths, and this is why the stigma is important, addressing it. There are a lot of myths around mental health and the mental health and wellness. And the one that really sticks in my craw is the second to the last one here. If you try hard enough, you can just snap out of it. And we know from the data, and we know from reality, we know from science, we know from medical study, that is not true. You can't just snap out of it. It is a complex and multifaceted challenge resulting in a combination of biological, physiological, and environmental factors that come into play. So this isn't a question of willpower or personal weakness. That's a huge one that I find frustrating. I'm going to go ahead and go to this next poll because I just talked about the stigmatization. So I'm curious, which of these is an actual type of a stigma? So there's personal stigma, perceived stigma, self-stigma, structural stigma, or all of them. So let me see if something did come in.
And Janelle, there is a question in the questions panel if you want to take a peek at that while the poll's open.
Yeah. Though diversity may improve teams and organizations, isn't it illegal to ask about these hidden diversity traits in interviews? Ooh, good question. I want to get to the, let's see, let me look here. I think I have. Yeah, let me get to, hold that thought, Roderick. I'm gonna hold that till we get past a couple more slides because might help address some of that. But I see we're almost at the end of the poll, and so far I can see almost everyone has gotten it right. And the correct answer is all of the above. And the reason that this is important to understand, and I think what almost 90 people said all of the above. A personal stigma is an attitude about other people. A perceived stigma is an attitude that I believe other people hold. Self-stigma is me attributing that to myself. It's my self-view. And a structural stigma is where there are policies or cultural norms, et cetera, that will restrict opportunities based on perceptions around someone living with, a mental health condition. And this stigma is very real. You see here the definition. It's a negative and often unfair social attitude attached to a person or a group. And they can apply in a number of different ways. So where I want to wrap us up then and come to bring this all to the point of awareness and understanding around the connection of identity is we know that there are different dimensions of us that are invisible. We know some of these are in particularly challenged groups, to Roderick's question. So how does this affect us day to day? Well, when you think about it, this is what I call hiding in plain sight. So let me just paint the scenario. I read about this in an article and I thought it was wonderful. And I want you to think about this as we go through these next examples or explanations of how we hide. So you're hanging out with your friends, you're talking, you're joking, you're laughing with each other. There's a flow to the conversation. It's easy, it doesn't feel forced. And this isn't just that conversation flows easily, it's that body language. It's natural, it's fluid, it's unrestrained, no tension, no anxiety. We're all just sort of hanging there. And everything feels right. There's no judgment, there's no caution, there's no hiding. Now, hopefully in your mind's eye, you can think of a time when you had this experience and things were easy with you, friends. Maybe there's even a smile coming to your face. Now I want to go back to that scene and say, but this time you're the only fill in the blank. I'm the only woman. I'm the only person here with a child. I'm the only person here who's married. I'm the only guy, whatever the case may be. The moment you notice that difference and you start to feel more conspicuous about that difference, perhaps it isn't as comfortable. Maybe you feel this low level of anxiety. Maybe you start thinking about what you say or how you say it because you don't want to stand out any more than you have to. And all of those adjustments, that's what I'm talking about as assimilation strategies. So 4 strategies I'm going to highlight. Number 1, it's called code switching. And that scenario where I might start to say things differently or laugh at things differently or gesture differently, all of those changes in the way we communicate, it's called code switching. And code switching is completely normal. Where it becomes a challenge is where somebody is doing it to cover up, to minimize their differences, to try to blend in as much as possible to not stand out. So an example might be someone who's bilingual and they never speak their other language. Perhaps it's their first language, when other people can hear them, because they don't want to be stigmatized as somebody from that group, whatever group that is. The next one is holding back. And holding back is when you intentionally and actively suppress or hide some aspect of your identity, a belief, your opinions, because you don't want to stand out and face potential either discrimination or isolation or judgment or perceptions that you're less competent. Covering. This is similar, but this is the practice of intentionally and consciously downplaying or minimizing some aspect of you that you might feel would stigmatize you, or otherwise what I just described, that you seem incompetent, you're not friendly, you're not safe, you aren't committed, those kinds of things. And then the fourth one, and many of us are familiar with this, overcompensating. And this is, going above and beyond to prove our competence in a particular area. And so this can mean working harder and trying to be more assertive, or seeking out additional, certifications and qualifications, because you want to dispel any myths, any stereotypes, or any negative assumptions. Those are all coping strategies, assimilation strategies. And so this gets to your question, Roderick. Though diversity may improve teams and organizations, isn't it illegal to ask about these diversity traits? Yes, we can't overtly ask certain questions because it might be discriminatory. And in fact, we need to really think about our recruiting strategies, because we want to eliminate any chance of bias. Now, we can't eliminate all bias, but what we can do is we can try to change our systems and our practices to reduce the opportunities for subjectivity to enter into the picture. And one of the reasons this is important is all of those strategies that I just talked about. When you have to put in the effort to hold something back, cover something up, try to show up differently, i.e. not yourself, i.e. not authentically, there's a disproportionate amount of energy you have to put into all of this, and that's exhausting. It's referred to the emotional tax. Data tells us over time, it leads to higher turnover from people who are in minority groups. And keep in mind, minority groups are based on whoever the majority is. We're often referring to generally marginalized groups, traditionally marginalized groups, the kind that are covered in, the Civil Rights Act. So gender, LGBTQ identity, race, disability, and so on. But anyone who's the other in the organization, or the one of the few, that's the minority group that's going to struggle with this. And so I want to end with this. Somebody asked what dimensions of diversity change. Well, for example, I have an invisible disability. It wasn't diagnosed until I was in my late 40s. So I went from somebody without a disability to somebody with a disability, and it is an invisible disability. Somebody might suffer from traumatic brain injury somewhere along their life, and it changes the functioning of the brain, neurodiversity. So there are a lot of things that can change. I could have a child, and my child has a developmental disability. And so now I'm dealing with, that's horrible. I'm caring for a child with special needs, and that puts me in a different category. And you may never know. Remember, dimensions of diversity that are invisible are all the things you know about somebody. Rephrase, you don't know about somebody because you can't see them unless they reveal them. So not only can diversity of dimensions change, oftentimes those are the invisible dimensions. All right, so I'm going to end then with this diversity awareness matrix. And I created this matrix because I really wanted to help us understand then, when you think about these different dimensions of diversity and how we interact, the assumptions we make, it falls along two axes. One is, how familiar are we with that thing, neurodiversity, disability, the complexities of race, the gender spectrum? How familiar are we with these? And then, are they something we can see, or are they invisible? Now, the way this works is lower left quadrant is what we call the growth zone. In this space, whatever the dimension of diversity is, you can't see it and you're not familiar with it. And as a result, you might be a little more sympathetic. And remember, We all don't want you to feel bad for us. You might say or do something that has an unintended impact because you didn't realize that the joke you just made was offensive because somebody in the room would have been, I'd say, what the brunt of the joke and not in a good way. Now go up, and so you're unfamiliar. It's not something you can visibly see, but you're familiar with it, and so that might pull you from sympathy to empathy. You might be a little bit more passive and comfortable around this. You might be more engaged with this person. There's this natural vibe that we sometimes get when we share something, especially if it's unseen. Now you go over to the lower right, though, we have what I call the connection zone. So here you can see something, but you're not as familiar with it. And at its best, you're curious. You're willing to adapt as you learn, and you're very respectful of it because I can see it, and now as I come to understand it more, fill in the blank, it gets better. But in the upper top right corner, what I like the best here, and this is not going to be the true for everybody, but if you're in this corner, in this quadrant, depending on the person you're connecting with, you're going to be comfortable. You're going to be more receptive. You're going to be open because it is familiar to you, that dimension of diversity. Neurodiversity is familiar to me, and I can see it. And by this, I don't mean visibly see it. I'm aware of it because it's been brought to my attention. So these are important because when you think about those different quadrants, how you are interacting with somebody might, and what you're perceiving about somebody and what you're reacting to is a combination of, does it ring familiar? Do I know what this is? And am I aware, whether because I can see it or somebody has told me, is it visible to me? So I just want you to think about that. So at the end of the day, my final thoughts here, just because you have something in common, don't assume they're like you. Familiarity doesn't mean sameness. Being self-aware is what can help us to, in that quadrant, recognize where we are and how it might be impacting our behavior, how we're showing up, and how we might be making someone else feel. You have in your handout my contact slide. So if you have a follow-up question you didn't think about, you're more than welcome to reach out to me by email. Hey, connect on LinkedIn. Let me know where you heard about me. And so with that, again, thank you all for joining me today.